I never thought I'd be the guy sitting across from corporate lawyers explaining why my wife broke into my office at 3 in the morning with a recording device in her purse. But here we are. The thing about working in compliance and internal investigations is that you spend your whole career hunting down corporate spies, data thieves, and insider threats, never once imagining that the biggest security breach of your professional life would come from the woman who promised to love you until death do you part. Let me tell you how a GPS tracker, some toxic suburban gossip, and one spectacularly unhinged break-in turned my 15-year marriage into a criminal case and left me standing in the wreckage wondering how we got here. We moved to Austin 3 years ago when Northline Tech offered me a senior management position that came with serious money and even more serious responsibility. Senior Compliance Manager with a focus on internal investigations, which is a fancy way of saying, I'm the guy who hunts down people inside the company stealing secrets, leaking data, or playing games with regulations that could land everyone in federal prison. It's methodical work that requires patience, attention to detail, and the ability to keep emotions locked down tight, because the second you let feelings cloud judgment, you miss something crucial and the bad guys slip through. I'd spent 12 years at my previous company building a reputation as someone who could follow digital breadcrumbs through complex corporate mazes and come out with airtight cases that ended careers and sometimes resulted in prosecutions. The Austin opportunity was everything we'd worked toward. Real money, real responsibility, and a chance to live somewhere warm instead of a cramped apartment in a city where winter lasted 9 months. Lauren seemed genuinely excited when I told her about the offer. We'd been talking about starting fresh somewhere with space to breathe and maybe finally start the family we'd been putting off because my career demanded 60-hour weeks, and her anxiety about finances made her reluctant to take time off. We found a house in Cedar Park, one of those sprawling suburban developments north of the city where every third house has the same floor plan and the homeowners association sends passive-aggressive letters if your grass hits 3 inches. The house was perfect on paper. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a backyard big enough for the dog we talked about getting, and a neighborhood full of young professionals who seemed friendly in that superficial suburban way. We moved in on a Saturday in July when the temperature hit 108 degrees. I remember standing in the driveway watching the moving truck pull away and thinking this was it. This was the American dream wrapped up in a 30-year mortgage and a commute that would take 45 minutes each way if traffic was light and closer to 90 during rush hour. The first few months were a blur of onboarding at Northline, learning the political landscape of a company where everyone smiled in meetings while plotting to steal credit for your work or blame you for their failures. Tech companies are vicious in ways people don't talk about. My job was to navigate that minefield while building an investigations team that could handle everything from intellectual property theft to harassment complaints to executives who thought expense fraud was victimless. I was working 12 to 14-hour days, coming home after 9 most nights, eating whatever Lauren left in the fridge, then reviewing case files until midnight before collapsing for 5 hours of sleep and starting over. It was brutal, but necessary. You don't build a reputation in compliance by working 9 to 5. You build it by being the person who catches things everyone else misses, who documents everything meticulously, and who never lets personal considerations interfere with professional obligations. I thought I was building our future. I thought the sacrifice would be worth it once we got established. What I didn't see was that Lauren was drowning. She'd left her job, her friends, her entire support system to move to a city where she knew absolutely no one. I'd wake before dawn and leave while she slept. I'd come home after dark to find her already in bed or staring at the television with this blank expression I told myself was just tiredness or adjustment. She tried to talk to me about feeling isolated, about spending entire days without speaking to another human being, about how the house felt too big and too empty. I listened, or thought I was listening, but didn't really hear her. I'd nod and suggest she join a gym or take online classes or volunteer somewhere, then go back to reviewing surveillance logs. I thought she'd figure it out. I thought she was resilient enough to handle a few months of transition while I established myself. I was wrong. It started with yoga. She found a studio near the house offering morning classes, figured it would be a good way to meet people and get structure in her days. The yoga itself was fine, typical suburban wellness stuff with expensive mats and instructors talking about energy while playing music that sounded like someone crying into a synthesizer. But the real action happened after class, when a group of women would go to brunch at places serving $20 avocado toast and bottomless mimosas. Lauren got invited, and suddenly had plans every Saturday morning that didn't involve waiting for me to have time for her. I was relieved, honestly. I thought this was exactly what she needed. What I didn't know was that this particular group had one thing in common beyond overpriced brunch and activewear. Every single one was either divorced, divorcing, or plotting escape from marriages they'd convinced themselves were prisons. At the center was Megan Sloan, 45 years old and wearing her divorce like a Purple Heart from a war she'd won by sheer bitterness. Megan had the look of a woman who'd spent significant alimony maintaining an appearance that screamed she was over her ex-husband, while every word proved she was still fighting him in her head daily. Expensive highlights that couldn't hide the hardness in her eyes, designer workout clothes that cost more than my car payment, and a smile that never reached past her cosmetically enhanced cheekbones. She'd been married to some corporate attorney who'd apparently cheated with a 25-year-old paralegal, and rather than moving on like a rational adult, she'd made it her mission to prove all men were garbage, all marriages were lies, and any woman who thought she had a faithful husband was either stupid or in denial. Megan had a talent for identifying weakness, the way predators smell fear. And Lauren, my sweet, trusting, emotionally vulnerable wife who was already feeling lost and alone, might as well have had a target painted on her back. Megan started slow, the way good manipulators do. Just casual comments at first about how men change once they feel secure, how long hours at work are often convenient covers for other activities, how wives are always the last to know. Little seeds of doubt, planted carefully and watered with just enough plausible deniability that Lauren probably didn't realize she was being programmed to see threats that didn't exist. The changes in Lauren were subtle at first, incremental shifts you might not notice if you're exhausted and distracted. She started asking more questions about my day, but not in the supportive way she used to. These were interrogations disguised as casual conversation. Who did I have lunch with today? Why did that meeting run until 7? How come I didn't answer my phone at 2:30? What was that $47 restaurant charge I'd never mentioned? At first I tried being patient, figured she just needed reassurance that I was still present, even if not physically home much. I'd explain about traffic on Interstate 35, about how construction turned a 45-minute commute into 90 minutes of parking lot, about conference calls running over because executives love their own voices, about the phone being silent during presentations. But no matter how detailed my explanations, no matter how logical and consistent, I could see this look in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She wasn't listening to understand, she was listening to find holes, to catch inconsistencies that would prove whatever crime she'd already decided I was guilty of. Then the financial surveillance started. I'd leave my wallet on the counter and find it in a different position, credit cards rearranged. Bank statements I'd recycled would migrate back, highlighted in yellow with margin notes questioning completely mundane charges. A $23 lunch became evidence of a secret meal with someone I was supposedly seeing. Gas purchases were cross-referenced against my work schedule to see if timing made sense. She started casually mentioning errands near my office, which I recognized as code for driving by to see if my truck was actually in the parking lot. The shirt sniffing started around month 4. I'd wake in the middle of the night and find her in our closet with one of my dress shirts pressed against her face, breathing deep like searching for traces of perfume that weren't there. The first time I caught her, she startled like I'd caught her stealing, tried to play it off like she missed me and wanted to smell my cologne. But I'd seen her face before she knew I was watching. That wasn't affection, that was investigation. I should have confronted her then, demanded to know what was happening and why she'd decided to treat me like a suspect instead of her husband. But I made a critical error. I assumed this was temporary, some adjustment anxiety that would burn itself out once she got settled, and realized I was exactly who I'd always been. I thought logic and consistency would win. I thought if I just kept being faithful, kept being honest, maintained the same patterns, she'd eventually see her suspicions were baseless. That was my first major miscalculation, because Lauren wasn't operating on logic anymore. She was operating on fear, and fear doesn't respond to evidence. Fear feeds on itself, grows fat on coincidences, and turns them into patterns. And Lauren had Megan in her ear 3 times a week, reinforcing every paranoid thought. The Tuesday I found the GPS tracker was the day I realized this had moved beyond uncomfortable into genuinely dangerous. I'd been hearing this weird clicking from my truck for about a week, something that only happened on sharp turns or speed bumps. First thought was suspension issues, maybe a worn bushing or loose sway bar link. So I grabbed a flashlight and crawled underneath to look at the front suspension. That's when I saw it. This little black magnetic case, about cigarette pack sized, stuck to the inside frame rail right behind the passenger front wheel well. For 3 seconds my brain tried to rationalize it as something legitimate. Maybe a dealership recall device, maybe diagnostic tool left during service. Then I pulled it off and saw the LED indicator, the Amazon logo and price tag still partially attached. A consumer-grade GPS tracker, the kind you buy for $50 online to monitor someone's every movement through an app on their phone. I didn't get angry right away. I got cold. The temperature in my body seemed to drop 20 degrees in a heartbeat, and this clarity washed over me that was almost clinical. This wasn't a marriage problem anymore. This was a violation of privacy, potentially illegal, and definitely behavior indicating someone had crossed a line from which there was no coming back. I took the device inside, set it deliberately on the kitchen table right next to her wine glass, and waited for her to come downstairs. When she walked in and saw that GPS tracker sitting there, her face went through an incredible journey in about 5 seconds. Shock, because she clearly didn't expect me to find it. Fear, because she realized she'd been caught. Defiance, because she'd spent months building a narrative that justified this surveillance. And then righteous anger that I'm certain came straight from Megan's playbook. She didn't apologize. She didn't break down crying. She didn't acknowledge that planting a tracking device on your spouse's vehicle is a massive violation. Instead, she attacked. Started yelling about how innocent people don't get angry about being monitored, how if I had nothing to hide, I shouldn't have a problem with her knowing where I was. How her friends warned her I'd react exactly like this because guilty men always play victim when caught. She was reciting a script, hitting talking points downloaded into her brain by someone who'd never met me, never witnessed our marriage, never seen a single moment of 15 years together. I let her finish. I stood in our kitchen listening to my wife accuse me of crimes I hadn't committed and justify illegal surveillance with logic from someone thoroughly radicalized by a bitter divorcee with an agenda. When she finally ran out of steam, breathing hard and waiting for me to grovel or confess, I said one sentence: "You just ended this marriage." Her face went pale. The anger drained and was replaced by panic. She started backpedaling immediately, saying she didn't mean it like that, she was just scared, just wanted to trust me again, just needed to know I wasn't lying. But it was too late. You don't plant GPS tracking devices on your spouse and claim it's love. You don't run surveillance and expect them to believe you respect them. You don't cross that line and pretend you can step back. I thought that would be the end. I really believed finding the tracker would serve as a wake-up call, shocking her back to reality. I figured she'd realize she'd gone too far, maybe agree to therapy, and we'd either rebuild or proceed with civilized divorce. But I underestimated how deep the poison had gone. Megan and her divorce club had convinced Lauren she was in a war. And in war, you don't surrender because the enemy finds one surveillance device. You escalate. You find new tactics. You double down. So she escalated. Started trying to hack my phone, email, work accounts. I noticed because my iPhone battery started dying twice as fast, and cellular data spiked to levels that didn't make sense. Took about 10 minutes to find the Spyware she'd installed, some cheap monitoring app from a Google search for how to spy on a cheating spouse. The irony was almost funny. She was trying to conduct digital surveillance on the head of internal investigations for a tech company, like trying to pickpocket a magician. I could have locked her out completely, changed every password, encrypted everything so the NSA would struggle. But I didn't. I wanted to see how far she'd go. I needed to know if this would stop or keep escalating until something broke beyond repair. So I set up a dummy email account, fed it enough boring work correspondence to keep her busy, and let her think she'd won. Meanwhile, I was building a case file on my own wife. Screenshots of spyware, logs showing access attempts, timestamps proving when and how often she tried reading my private communications. Building a case the same way I would on a corporate spy, and it felt sick and wrong and necessary all at once. The breaking point came on a Thursday in October when Marcus called, the head of physical security at Northline. Former military police who took his job seriously without being a jerk about it. He called around 6:30, apologetic but firm, said I needed to come to the lobby because there'd been an incident involving my wife. Apparently, Lauren had shown up without clearance, tried to sweet-talk past security, claiming she was bringing me dinner as a surprise. When that didn't work, she started making a scene about needing to see me for an emergency, loud enough that other employees noticed, and security had to intervene. Marcus had calmed her down and escorted her out, but the whole thing was captured on cameras and technically constituted an access control violation. He wanted me to know because it would generate an incident report going to HR and possibly my boss. I thanked him, hung up, and sat in my car feeling humiliation burn through me like acid. This woman had just embarrassed me in front of colleagues and potentially put my professional reputation at risk. I drove home doing 80, barely processing traffic, brain cycling through anger and disbelief and cold clarity getting sharper with every mile. When I walked in, Lauren was at the kitchen table scrolling her phone like nothing happened. I asked point blank what she thought she was doing showing up at my office unannounced and creating a scene with security. She had the nerve to look offended, said she'd just been in the area and thought she'd surprise me with dinner, and if I wasn't hiding anything, it shouldn't be a problem for my wife to visit. I told her the truth. She'd been flagged by security, her behavior was documented on camera, She'd violated access policies and created an incident that would be reviewed by HR and possibly legal. She'd crossed a professional line that could have real consequences for my career. She laughed. Actually laughed like I was being ridiculous, said I was dramatic, that if I wasn't hiding anything, it shouldn't matter who stopped by, that maybe if I came home at reasonable hours, she wouldn't have to track me down at work. I realized I wasn't talking to the woman I'd married anymore. This was someone so thoroughly infected by Megan's toxic worldview that reality didn't matter. Facts didn't matter. Video evidence didn't matter. Only the narrative mattered, and the narrative was that I was guilty, I was hiding something, and every defensive move was further proof of deception. I should have locked everything down that night, should have changed locks, revoked her access to anything connected to work, started divorce proceedings immediately. But I made one more mistake. I didn't think she'd be desperate or irrational enough to commit an actual criminal act. 3 nights later, at 2:47 in the morning, I found out exactly how wrong I was. My phone exploded with alerts, the security system at North Line sending warnings about unauthorized access on my floor, door sensors triggered in my office area, motion detectors picking up movement in spaces that should be empty. I sat up, grabbed my phone, pulled up live security camera feed, with dread already crystallizing into certainty. And there she was, crouched under my desk, trying to install what looked like a recording device using adhesive tape that clearly wasn't sticking right. The security feed was crystal clear, high-definition color with audio, the kind we'd installed because my department deals with sensitive investigations. I could see her hands shaking as she fumbled with the device, hear her breathing hard and muttering, watch her glancing at the door like she expected to get caught. And then she did. 2 security guards entered, professional and calm, asking her to please stand up and keep her hands visible. She started crying immediately, trying to explain she was just worried about her husband, that she had a right to know if he was cheating. One of the guards was reading her rights, not company policy, actual Miranda rights. Because what she'd done wasn't just corporate security violation or embarrassing personal incident, it was criminal trespass, attempted installation of illegal surveillance, and, depending on how legal wanted to handle it, potentially industrial espionage, since she'd broken into a compliance office handling confidential investigations. I watched the whole thing on my phone while sitting in our bed and felt something fundamental break inside that I knew would never heal. I drove to the police station where they'd taken her, sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes trying to process what my life had become, deciding whether to go inside and try to fix this or protect myself and let consequences fall. Part of me wanted to be the husband who makes calls and pulls strings to make it go away. But the professional part, the part that spent 15 years building a reputation on integrity and thorough documentation, knew I couldn't. What she'd done was serious. Federal law serious. The kind that could destroy both our lives if I was seen as complicit. When I finally went inside, she was in an interrogation room looking smaller and more frightened than I'd ever seen her. The moment she saw me, her face lit with desperate hope, and she started talking fast about how this was a misunderstanding, how I needed to tell them she had permission, how I'd given her my access card. I looked at the detective, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who'd probably seen every variety of human stupidity, and told the truth. My wife did not have permission to enter that building. She had stolen my backup key card from my home office without my knowledge. She had committed breaking and entering with intent to install illegal surveillance. I had video evidence, time-stamped and logged. And no, I would not be vouching for her or requesting leniency. Lauren's face went from hopeful to horrified to furious in about 5 seconds. Started screaming that I was supposed to love her, protect her, that I was choosing my job over our marriage. What kind of husband lets his wife get arrested? I let her scream, let her exhaust herself while the detective took notes and recording equipment captured everything. And when she finally ran out of breath, sitting there with tears streaming down her face, I said the only thing that mattered. You chose Megan's paranoia over 15 years of fidelity. You chose to believe I was a cheater based on nothing except insecurity and poisonous advice from a bitter woman you'd known less than 6 months. You chose to commit multiple felonies, pursuing proof that didn't exist because there was nothing to find. I didn't end this marriage. You burned it down, and I'm just refusing to die in the fire with you. The legal consequences were catastrophic. Northline filed a civil lawsuit for damages, security breach, and potential compromise of confidential information. The DA charged her with criminal trespass, attempted installation of illegal surveillance, and theft of company property. The judge issued a restraining order barring her from within 500 feet of me or my workplace, pending the criminal case outcome. Her lawyer, some slick operator retained using money from her parents, tried to paint her as a desperate woman driven to extremes by a cheating husband. But that defense crumbled when we submitted evidence showing there was no cheating, no affair, no secret life. Just a faithful husband working long hours and a wife radicalized by toxic friends. The fallout was biblical. Her parents called screaming about how I needed to drop charges and be a man instead of hiding behind lawyers. I emailed them the security footage without commentary. They never called again. Her friends, the brunch and yoga crowd that encouraged every paranoid step, evaporated. Megan blocked her number the minute she heard criminal charges and civil liability. Solidarity only extends to the first threat of legal consequences. Lauren took a plea deal for reduced charges in exchange for probation, mandatory counseling, and staying away from me and my workplace. The civil suit settled for an amount that wiped out her savings and left her financially dependent on furious parents. I moved through divorce proceedings like a machine, methodical and emotionless, completely focused on protecting myself from further damage. Every time her lawyer angled for sympathy or argued for alimony, I'd submit another piece of documented evidence showing her pattern of harassment, illegal surveillance, and criminal behavior. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with no patience for this mess, granted me everything. Full divorce, no spousal support, asset division heavily favoring me given her criminal conduct. The house went on the market within a month because I couldn't live there anymore. Every room was contaminated with memories of trust turned toxic, love transformed into surveillance. I found a place downtown, a modern apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lady Bird Lake and the Austin skyline. Minimal furniture, no clutter, no shared memories or ghosts, just clean lines and empty space where I could breathe without feeling watched or suspected. The first night there, I poured 3 fingers of bourbon and stood on the balcony watching city lights reflect off the water, waiting to feel something. Sadness, maybe, or anger, or regret. But all I felt was relief. The crushing weight of being constantly suspected, constantly monitored, constantly presumed guilty, had lifted. I was free. Months passed. Austin's summer gave way to fall, which in Texas means the temperature drops from soul-crushing to merely oppressive. I settled into routines entirely mine. Morning runs around the lake before work. Lunch with colleagues who respected my judgment. Evening bourbon on the balcony while reading case files or watching sunset paint the sky orange and purple. I dated occasionally, nothing serious, women I met through work events or friends who thought I needed to get back out there. But I found myself unwilling to let anyone too close, not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't trust my own ability to recognize warning signs before they metastasized. One Saturday afternoon at Whole Foods, loading overpriced organic vegetables into my cart, like the Austin cliché I'd become, I saw her. Lauren, looking thinner and older than I remembered, pushing her cart past prepared foods. She saw me at the same moment. For about 5 seconds we stared at each other across the refrigerated kombucha display, and I could see her calculating whether to approach, whether to try to talk. I made the decision for both of us. I nodded once, simple acknowledgement that we'd both survived and moved on, then turned back to my shopping. I didn't need closure. I didn't need apologies or explanations. The story was over, and I was content with the ending. I heard through mutual acquaintances she'd moved back to Oklahoma, living with her parents, trying to rebuild some kind of normal life after the criminal conviction and divorce and total collapse of everything she'd built in Austin. Megan apparently moved to California and was busy poisoning new social circles out there. The yoga studio closed down, possibly because their primary demographic realized bottomless mimosas and toxic friend groups make spectacular disasters. The universe has a way of balancing its books eventually. These days, when I'm training new investigators at Northline, I tell them the most important skill isn't technical knowledge or attention to detail or even ability to follow complex digital trails. It's knowing when to trust your instincts about people. Red flags aren't always obvious. Sometimes they look like innocent questions or casual curiosity. Sometimes they come wrapped in concern or dressed up as love. But if you pay attention, if you trust your gut, and document everything with professional precision, the truth always reveals itself. Usually in ways that are messy and painful and completely avoidable if people would just communicate honestly instead of building cases against those they claim to love. I don't regret how I handled things. I protected myself, protected my career, and refused to enable behavior that had crossed every possible boundary. Could I have been more understanding, more forgiving, more willing to overlook GPS trackers and spyware and breaking into my office? Maybe some people would have made that choice, but understanding has limits. Forgiveness has boundaries. And when someone chooses to believe the worst about you despite years of evidence to the contrary, when they weaponize their insecurity and turn your marriage into a criminal investigation, they've already ended the relationship. I just had the clarity to recognize it and the strength to walk away with my integrity intact. The apartment is quiet now in a good way. The silence isn't empty or lonely, it's peaceful. I've got my routines, my work that I'm genuinely good at, my autonomy that nobody questions or monitors. No one's tracking my movements or reading my emails or sniffing my clothes for evidence of affairs that don't exist. I wake up when I want, work late when cases demand it, and answer to no one but myself and the professional standards I've spent my career upholding. It's not the life I imagined when I married Lauren all those years ago. It's not the suburban dream we moved to Austin to chase. But it's honest, it's clean, and it's entirely mine. Sometimes late at night, standing on my balcony with bourbon watching city lights shimmer across the water, I think about the trajectory from a GPS tracker under my truck to a criminal case that made local news. I think about how Megan managed to take a woman I loved and transform her into someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of crimes I never would have imagined. I think about how quickly trust erodes when you surround yourself with people who profit from your paranoia. And I think about how the real betrayal wasn't anything I did or didn't do. It was Lauren's choice to believe a stranger's poison over 15 years of fidelity. The bourbon I'm drinking is older than my marriage was. That's a weird realization, that this liquid spent more time aging in a barrel than I spent building a life with someone who destroyed it all based on fantasies fed by a bitter divorcee with an agenda. But the bourbon's still good, still smooth, still worth savoring slowly while the city spreads out below like a constellation of possibilities. And that's what I've learned from surviving this particular disaster. Some people will poison themselves with suspicion and try to drag you down with them. Some people will choose paranoia over partnership and expect you to participate in your own destruction. And when that happens, the only winning move is to step back and let them face consequences alone. I've got no regrets about how this ended. Lauren made her choices, and I made mine. She chose to listen to Megan's toxic advice, and I chose to trust documented evidence. She chose to escalate from suspicion to surveillance to criminal trespass, and I chose to protect myself and my career. She chose to burn down our marriage, and I chose to survive the fire with my reputation intact. The ending isn't happy in the Hallmark movie sense, but it's honest. And after everything we went through, after all the GPS trackers and spyware and spectacular criminal stupidity, honesty is the only thing that actually matters. The city lights are reflecting off Lady Bird Lake like scattered stars, and somewhere out there in the Austin suburbs, other couples are probably having the same fights we had, making the same mistakes Lauren made, choosing fear over trust and paranoia over communication. But that's their story to live through and learn from. Mine is over. I'm 43 years old, single, professionally successful, and genuinely at peace for the first time in years. No surveillance, no suspicion, no interrogations disguised as conversation, just me, my bourbon, and the hard-earned understanding that sometimes the person you need to investigate most carefully is the one who's investigating you.